1. The cracked silence. My weekend retreat was a cabin-style house nestled on the edge of town. It wasn't remote wilderness, but the surrounding houses were spaced far enough apart that days could easily pass without a single sight of a neighbor or the nuisance of a solicitor. Driving past, most people wouldn't even register the homes. They'd simply see an endless stretch of dense forest. The world outside was muffled by a heavy, recent snowfall, lending the whole area an unnerving, profound silence. A thick, brilliant blanket of white covered everything, making the woods behind my home look deeper and darker than I remembered. I usually relished the solitude here. The house itself was wonderfully cozy, boasting expansive, floor-to-ceiling windows, a magnificent stone fireplace, and that comforting, rustic cabin atmosphere, the very reason I'd bought the place. The first night was uneventful until very late. I stayed up in the living room, watching YouTube, slowly drifting into a half-sleep state around midnight. Eventually, I shut off the TV and walked down the short hallway to my bedroom. Since it was a single-story home, my room was right at the end. Like the rest of the house, my bedroom was dominated by massive windows, and it even featured a sliding glass door that faced directly into the dark woods. Given the privacy of the location, surrounded only by trees and no close neighbors, the design was logical, but it often felt strange. At night, merely seeing my own reflection in the vast glass panels could startle me, creating the momentary, heart-stopping illusion that someone was standing right outside. But this night was genuinely different. As I killed the last light and slipped under the covers, I heard it. A soft, distinct cracking sound from outside. It wasn't the natural shifting of the trees or the typical creaks of the forest. This was louder, sharper. The definite sound of someone stepping down onto a thick branch under the snow. A few seconds later, the sound repeated. I sat up instantly, eyes fixed on the immense window wall. Because the room was dark, I could see out through the glass fairly well. I stared into the darkness for maybe 30 agonizing seconds before something moved in the solid blackness between two tall pine trees. It wasn't a distinct shape I could identify, but a sudden, rapid shift of a shadow. It was like someone quickly leaned into view, or perhaps leaned out of it. Couldn't be sure. After that initial motion, everything fell completely still. I waited there, nerves building rapidly inside me. After minutes of intense scrutiny, I started to doubt myself, wondering if my eyes were just playing tricks, seeing forms in the oppressive dark. Yet I didn't move for a long time. Eventually, I forced myself to get out of bed and double-check that the sliding glass door was locked tight, then returned to bed. Took me forever to finally fall asleep. Every 30 seconds, I felt compelled to open my eyes and scan the window again, but each time, I saw nothing. The next day was permeated by a strange, unshakable feeling. Nothing overtly happened, but everything felt profoundly wrong in a way I couldn't articulate. I was plagued by that subtle, constant, uneasy sensation that someone was standing just out of sight, their eyes fixed on me. I kept darting glances at whichever window was nearest, half expecting to see a face peering in. I never did, but the cold dread simply wouldn't dissipate. As the day waned and darkness returned, snow began to fall again. This actually eased my tension slightly. It seemed even more unlikely that anyone would be lurking outside in the bitter cold and fresh snowfall. I told myself to stop overthinking. Around 10 o'clock, I was settled on the living room couch, wrapped in a blanket, enjoying the warmth of the fireplace and watching TV. The glow from the screen provided most of the light, and it wasn't until I got up to grab a soda that I realized just how dark the rest of the house was. As I walked down the main hallway, I noticed the light in the den. The small room with the bookshelves at the far end was off. I was certain I had left it on earlier. I always kept it illuminated. It provided a nice, ambient light that prevented the rest of the house from feeling like a shadowy cave. I walked over and quickly flipped the light switch back up, dismissing the incident, grabbed my soda, and returned to the couch. I had only been sitting there for perhaps a minute, having just unpaused the TV, when I happened to glance over my shoulder. I wasn't deliberately checking anything. It was just one of those involuntary, automatic glances you make for no reason. The light in the den was off again. I felt the blood drain instantly from my face. I stood up slowly and walked down the hallway just far enough to see the switch from where I stood. The light switch was physically flipped down in the off position. I just stared at it. Someone was inside that house, and it felt like they were trying to lure me into that room. I started backing away, my heart hammering. My phone was charging on the nightstand in my bedroom, and my car keys were hanging by the front door. I knew I had to get both and escape immediately. I moved as quietly as possible toward the other hallway and into my bedroom, snatching my phone. But before I could turn, I caught a slight movement behind the glass. I looked up. At first, all I saw were faint, disturbed footprints tracing through the snow just outside the window, until my eyes followed them to a large, imposing figure. A man was standing just a couple of feet beyond the glass. He was completely shrouded by the dark, but I knew with absolute certainty that he was staring directly in at me. I sprinted back down the hall toward the front door, grabbing my keys. As I did, I clearly heard not one, but two sets of footsteps pounding on the other side of the house. I tore the front door open and ran for the side driveway where my car was parked. The instant I was safely inside and starting the engine, I saw the first figure. The same man I'd seen at the window, come barreling around the corner of the house, sprinting toward my car. I threw the vehicle into gear and fled for the main road, watching his dark figure stand where my car had just been, stationary, watching me drive away into the night. It took a little over 30 minutes for the officers to arrive at my property. What they found was horrifying. Multiple windows had been violently shattered, and the entire house looked as though it had been systematically destroyed from the inside. Doors and cabinets were ripped clean from their hinges, furniture was flipped over, and deep dents and tears marred the walls. I told the police I'd heard two people inside and saw one man outside, but given the sheer wreckage they left, it was impossible for the police to know exactly how the intruders had gotten in so quietly while I had been home all day. I stayed in a hotel for weeks afterward, arranging for the house to be repaired and immediately putting it up for sale. I couldn't escape the horrifying feeling of knowing that 3 people had been stalking me for who knows how long. Had I not escaped when I did, I cannot even begin to imagine the horrible, disturbing things that would have occurred that night. Even now, I have chilling nightmares of myself walking down that hallway, approaching the room with the light off, knowing exactly what monstrous thing was waiting for me just beyond the doorway. 2. Piper's warning: my name is Noah, and I'm 36. I need to give a bit of background to explain my unusual living situation. 2 years before this happened, my wife and I broke up just a few months after purchasing a massive house together. It wasn't a bitter separation, and the divorce wasn't finalized until months later, but the house remained. It was enormous, far too big for even the two of us, but we had bought it with the future in mind. Space for kids, dogs, and everything else. When we split, I was left with the choice: sell it at a loss or continue living in the echoing space alone. I chose to stay. For 2 full years, I lived in that gigantic, empty house by myself. I kept telling myself I'd find ways to utilize the space. Since I worked from home, I planned to have a dedicated office, a workout room, and a separate bedroom, giving the house some purpose. But I never got around to it. The vast house remained hollow and mostly vacant. If you opened a random door, chances are there was nothing behind it but a dusty and used room. I wouldn't even step into half the rooms for months at a time. I tolerated the isolation, but occasionally, that uneasy feeling of being truly alone in a huge, empty structure would mix with a profound sense of loneliness. Finally, I decided to take a step I'd wanted for years. I adopted a dog from a local shelter. That's when everything started. I found an 8-month-old beagle puppy whom I named Piper. I picked her up after work from a shelter about 3 hours away. By the time we arrived home, it was around 8 p.m. I let her run around the yard for a bit, then brought her inside to explore her new surroundings. At the shelter, Piper had been nothing but excited, happy, and energetic, and she remained so during the car ride home. But the instant I let her inside, she became incredibly timid. I initially assumed she was just anxious from the unfamiliar environment and the sudden change, so I didn't worry too much. I sat on the couch to give her space to investigate alone. She spent only a couple of minutes walking around before she suddenly jumped up onto the couch with me, immediately huddling close on my lap. She seemed almost afraid of something, but again, I had every logical reason to believe this was simply normal, anxious behavior for a new puppy in a strange house. Later, I took her upstairs, and we settled in for the night. In the morning, things seemed slightly better. She followed me around while I made breakfast and coffee, then settled down calmly beneath my office desk while I started my workday. However, a few hours into the workday, she suddenly got up and walked toward the doorway, pausing halfway in the hall, looking extremely alert. After a few seconds, she quietly walked completely out of the room, and I could hear the faint click, click, click of her nails walking down the hallway toward the staircase. I thought she was finally comfortable enough to explore. I left her alone and kept working. Maybe 10 minutes passed when, suddenly, she erupted in furious, frantic barking from somewhere downstairs. I shot up from my desk and rushed out, hurrying down the steps. Piper's barks were echoing wildly through every corridor and room of the huge house, making it impossible to pinpoint her location. I called her name and moved through several rooms before finally finding her. Strangely, Piper was standing right in the dead center of one of the empty downstairs rooms, simply facing the wall and barking fiercely. The moment she saw me, she scurried over and stood right beside me, tail tucked low, looking nervously back into the vast, empty room. I walked in, finding nothing at all to explain her terror. The room was entirely vacant. I tried to calm her down, picking her up and quietly closing the door behind us. I carried her back upstairs to the office, and after a few minutes, I resumed working. The rest of that day passed without incident. When I finished work, I took her for a walk around the neighborhood. We spent the evening watching TV, then headed upstairs for bed around 10 o'clock. But in the middle of the night, I woke up. It wasn't a noise that woke me, but a sudden, chilling feeling. I sat up and saw Piper standing absolutely rigid, right up against the bedroom door, her ears perked high and her gaze locked intently on the small gap beneath the doorframe. I called her name gently, but she didn't move a muscle. And honestly, I still can't figure out why, but I simply laid back down and fell asleep without a second thought. I can't believe I managed it now that I reflect on it. I must have genuinely believed she was just struggling to adjust to a new place. I woke up in the morning, and things seemed fine. Piper was up on the bed with me and wasn't acting strangely at all. I got dressed, headed downstairs, let her outside, and did my typical morning routine. When she came back in, we went upstairs to my desk. Just like the day before, she laid down right under my desk while I worked. I made sure to check on her a few times, looking down at her, and each time she was sleeping peacefully, so I kept working. It wasn't until almost 6 p.m., as I was wrapping up my work and the sun had mostly set, that I looked down again, and she wasn't there. She must have slipped out without me noticing. I closed my laptop and stood up, calling Piper's name as I walked into the hallway, but I heard nothing. No sound of her walking around, no barking, nothing. The huge house was dead silent. Piper? Piper, where are you? My voice echoed hollowly through the empty spaces. An unnerving feeling washed over me as I walked down the hall and descended to the first floor. There was no sign of her anywhere. The silence was so profound that I could hear my own heart beginning to beat quickly in my chest. I walked down the next hallway, the one that led to the room where I had found her barking the day before. As I got closer, I noticed the door wasn't fully closed. It was cracked open, which I was certain I had not left it like that. I pushed it further open. Piper was huddled in the far corner of the room, shivering violently and facing the doorway I was standing in. She looked utterly terrified, as though something else was in the house with us. Her fear immediately gave me the sense to check behind me before approaching her. And when I spun around, I barely caught a glimpse of someone peering down the hallway back near the stairs. I quickly backed into the room and slammed the door shut, locking it and moving instantly toward Piper. A few seconds later, quiet, deliberate footsteps started coming down the hallway toward us. The person came right up to the other side of the door. Piper began to whimper quietly, still tightly huddled in the corner, staring wide-eyed at the door. I was honestly too scared to even move. I just stood frozen in the middle of the empty room, waiting for the inevitable to happen. The person behind the door also remained silent for a long moment before they started walking slowly back down the hallway. It was terrifying how confident their retreat sounded. No running, no panic. It felt like they were completely unfazed by anything that had just happened, or that this was exactly what they wanted, which made me wonder precisely what they were here for. I heard nothing else after that. I think I stayed trapped in that room with Piper for a full 30 minutes. I simply could not force myself to move. When I finally gathered the courage to unlock the door, I peered down the unlit hallway. All the way at the end, I could clearly see the front door standing wide open. Hoping this meant whoever it was had gone, I ran back upstairs to get my phone and call the police. While I was up there, I noticed several doors to other rooms that I always kept closed were now standing open. As soon as I grabbed my phone, I rushed back downstairs to Piper, holding up inside that locked room until the police finally arrived. They searched the house thoroughly and even several acres around the property but found nothing. No signs of the intruder remaining. However, they did find irrefutable signs of his presence in my home. In one of the unused rooms upstairs, the one located directly next to my office, they found a collection of random items suggesting that someone had been quietly living there, possibly for months. Worse yet, it appeared the person had likely been spending the days sleeping hidden away in the closet, so that I wouldn't notice or hear them, and would then emerge at night to leave and re-enter the home, or simply roam around inside the house. Of course, the moment I brought Piper into the home, her acute senses could immediately detect that someone else was living inside with us. This makes me realize that when I woke up in the middle of the night, finding Piper staring at the door, the intruder could have been walking around silently right outside the bedroom. And as for the time she was barking at the wall or ceiling, that room was directly below the one the person was using as their secret hideout. She must have heard them moving around up there. When it was all said and done, this event was enough to finally motivate me to sell the house and move into something much smaller, bringing Piper with me, of course. She is absolutely the best companion I ever could have asked for, and since moving, she has been just as happy and excited as she was when I found her at the shelter, and has not shown a single sign of anxiety. I still worry about the person never being found, and the slim chance they might come back. I know it's unlikely, but I think I'll never truly forget the horror of realizing I was not alone. 3. The mimic footsteps. I was 18 and still living at home with my parents, but I was old enough for them to leave me by myself without any issues. This was one of those times. My parents were gone for, I think, a couple of days. Our house was nothing special, just a typical suburban home in a quiet neighborhood. On these solo days, I usually just sat around watching TV or playing video games. I didn't have my own car, so unless I felt like walking 30 minutes for fast food, I had no real reason to leave the house. That morning, I stayed in bed for a few hours watching TV, then finally dragged myself up to start the day, heading downstairs to the kitchen. Almost immediately after I started making breakfast, my friend sent me a text message. I assumed he was just checking if I was online, so I finished cooking before checking the message. But when I finally opened it, I was a little confused. It read, "Who's the guy outside your house?" I was genuinely caught off guard. I quickly replied, "What?" and rushed to the front window to look, but there was nobody out there. No cars, no people, just an empty, quiet street. My friend's house was directly across the street from mine, and I couldn't see him at his window either, so I was completely baffled. After a minute, I decided to just call him, figuring it was some stupid joke he was trying to pull. He was prone to saying ridiculous stuff like that to mess with me, but this time I really couldn't grasp the punchline. He answered, and he didn't even try to play it off as a prank. He was dead serious, saying he had genuinely seen some guy outside my house, a person he had never seen before, and the only reason he even brought it up was because the man seemed to be actively trying to peer into the windows. It was supremely weird. Since neither of us could figure out who it was or what he was doing, and since he was gone now, we kind of just moved on, hopping into a Discord call to play video games for a few hours. I only went downstairs once during that time to refill my water bottle, and I made sure to take a quick look out the window again, seeing no one. We were online until probably 5 or 6 o'clock before finally logging off. All I remember was noticing that it was already dark outside and being surprised by how much time had passed. I got up and headed downstairs. I started quickly preparing a simple dinner, unsure how I would fill the rest of the night. Probably just watch TV in my room. But while I was in the kitchen, cooking, I saw a shadow move or flicker on the wall right in front of me. I immediately spun around. I saw nothing, no movement or anything in the living room that could have caused the flicker, until my gaze settled on the window. I walked up to it and looked out. It was dark and still. I didn't see anyone out there. The sudden image of someone possibly staring at me from outside gave me a cold, strong chill. I tried to reason with myself, thinking I was probably just on edge because of my friend's text. The shadow could have easily been a car passing by, or maybe a trick of the internal light. I was sure it was nothing to worry about. I finished making dinner and took it upstairs to my room to eat, then laid in bed and watched TV. I stayed up there for at least an hour, maybe a little more, just zoning out, half watching whatever was on. At some point, as my room grew darker, I realized I hadn't turned on any of the lights upstairs. It was just the TV screen illuminating the room, and I kept finding my eyes involuntarily shifting to the narrow crack beneath the bedroom door, where the hallway outside was completely black. Usually, the dark hallway never bothered me, but this night, it just felt inherently unsettling. Eventually, I paused the show and decided to get up and grab a snack from downstairs, though it was more of an excuse to walk around and turn on all the lights, hoping to shake off whatever pervasive feeling I had. The moment I opened my bedroom door, however, the feeling worsened significantly. The house felt too quiet, and the hallway was eerily dark. I quickly flicked on the light, seeing it was just an empty corridor, and feeling silly, almost annoyed with myself for being so thoroughly creeped out. I headed downstairs. Before getting my snack, I found myself checking the windows again. This level of paranoia was something I don't think I had ever felt before. I even left all the lights blazing downstairs, knowing I wasn't planning on coming back down before bed, just so I wouldn't have to worry about the first floor being pitch black. I started making my way back upstairs, but as I ascended the steps, I paused abruptly. I thought I had heard what sounded distinctly like my own footsteps resonating through the house, but the sound didn't seem quite right, and I had never heard the house echo sounds like that before. I took a few steps down, then back up, but the sound didn't repeat. I stood there, frozen and unsure for a moment, replaying the strange sound over and over in my head. My eyes widened, and my heart began racing. I suddenly bolted up the rest of the stairs and threw myself into my room, locking the door shut and immediately calling the police. I was 99% certain that what I had heard was someone else's footsteps inside the house, perfectly matching the timing of my own. It was almost as if they were deliberately mimicking my walking so that I wouldn't hear them silently approaching right behind me. Standing on the stairs, thinking it over, I realized that was exactly what the sound suggested. After I confirmed the police were on the way, I called my friend, asking if he could see anything outside. He said no, but he went to his front window while we were on the call, trying to look around. It was a couple of minutes later that he suddenly whispered, "Oh, SHT." He said he saw some guy climb out of a window on the side of my house and start running into the trees. He confirmed it looked like the same guy he had seen earlier that morning. I couldn't speak for a full minute, utterly terrified by how correct I had been about my paranoid feeling of not being alone. When the police arrived, I stood outside with them while they conducted their investigation. My friend also came out and spoke to the officers. The investigation didn't lead to much, aside from the promise to search for the man and follow up if any leads emerged. They did, however, mention a similar incident that had occurred a couple of weeks earlier in a nearby neighborhood where a child was also home alone and some guy was creeping around outside, eventually coming up to the window and trying to convince the child to let him in. In both cases, though, it remains unclear what he was truly plotting. Kidnapping is the obvious answer, but without a visible car, dragging a kid out of a house screaming didn't seem likely to me. I don't know what was going to happen to me that night, and I never found out because the guy is still out there, probably still creeping around and stalking someone else without them having any idea.